Hello to all the classic people that are returning. I'm glad you're back. I want to welcome any new visitors and let you know that there will be spoilers ahead. Today on Classic Movie Review, we are taking on Dr. X, 1932. IMDb.com rates this comedy/horror film at 6.4. This seems to be a fair rating. It could have been a decent horror film or a low-grade comedy, but it doesn't work as both. On RottenTomatoes.com, this film has an 82% on the tomato meter and 50% audience approval. Again, the film is stuck in the middle. The critics like it because of the early use of Technicolor. Still, I believe the audiences are put off by the amount of comedy, much of which is slapstick. New York Times film critic Mordan Hall said in an August 4, 1932 review, "When were movie critics invented? Quote, besides having quite enough excitement to satisfy the most ardent admirer of murder mysteries, the general effects of Dr. X is considerably enhanced by being filmed in Technicolor. It has some remarkable laboratory settings, and lest the spectator find the spine-chilling too much for them, there is a vein of adroitly conceived comedy relief. It is a production that almost makes Frankenstein seem tame and friendly, particularly in its penultimate glimpses. This parcel of thrills, streaked with fun, was directed by Michael Curtiz, who always keeps his eyes open wide for chances for striking camera work, and here his panache in that direction is assisted by the impressive setting, the more or less natural color effects, and also the weird sounds emitted during Dr. Xavier's experiments." Unquote. Actors. In his first significant role, Lionel Atwill plays the mysterious Dr. Jerry Xavier. Atwill was first covered as the inspector in Son of Frankenstein 1939, which was so well spoofed in Young Frankenstein. The original Scream Queen, Fay Wray, played Joanne Xavier, the daughter of Dr. X. Of course, Ray was first covered in King Kong 1933. Preston Foster was in the role of Dr. Wells. This actor was covered in the film noir Kansas City Confidential 1952. Lee Tracy played reporter Lee Taylor. Tracy was a skinny redhead with a high voice and a rapid-fire vocal delivery style. Tracy was born in Georgia in 1898. His father worked for the railroad, and his mother was a former schoolteacher. Young Tracy was sent to a military school in Illinois. While he was at school, the family relocated to upstate New York. After high school, Tracy attended Union College to study engineering. However, he showed a fondness for acting. Following graduation, Tracy joined an acting troupe. However, this work was interrupted when Tracy entered the Army for World War I. Following the war, Tracy became an agent for the U.S. Treasury. After about 2 years working for the government, Tracy left to work in vaudeville and tour with acting companies. He made his debut on Broadway in 1924. Tracy continued to act until he was given the first of many roles as a newspaperman in Broadway's The Front Page. His tendency for excessive drinking and causing trouble was beginning at this time. Tracy signed with Fox for films such as Big Time 1929, Born Reckless 1930, Lilium 1930, and She Got What She Wanted 1932. He jumped back to stage work, but signed with Warner Brothers for The Strange Love of Molly Louvain 1932, Dr. X 1932, and Blessed Event 1932. For Columbia, he was in Washington Merry-Go-Round 1932, The Nightmare 1932, and Carnival 1935. Tracy went to work for MGM, making Clear All Wires 1933, The Nuisance 1933, Turn Back the Clock 1933, Advice to the Forlorn 1933, Dinner at 8 1933, and Bombshell 1933. Tracy traveled to Mexico City to film Viva Villa 1934. However, his activities resulted in him being fired and the studio issuing a formal apology to the Mexican people. It has been reported that he urinated off a balcony on a passing military parade. Other people say this didn't happen. Following the incident in Mexico, Tracy worked on stage and for small film companies like RKO. He did well in The Payoff 1942 and High Tide 1947. Tracy worked on television in the 1950s and 1960s. He was part of a couple of television series. He reprised his Broadway role in The Best Man 1964 and received an Oscar nomination for Best Actor in a Supporting Role. Tracy died in 1968. I appreciate all the comments and emails I've gotten, and I want to thank everyone for doing that. If you get a chance, drop over to where you get your podcast and leave a review for the show. story. The solitary policeman, Mike, Harry Holman, walks his beat. After he passes, a man in a light-colored fedora rises from behind some barrels. The sign on the nearby building reads, Mott Street Mortuary. The man in the hat lights a cigarette and shudders as he sees the full moon. The man ducks as a car arrives at the morgue. 3 men get out of the car, walk past the waiting guard, and enter the morgue. One of the men, wearing a bowler hat and a fur-collared coat, is addressed as Doctor. The man in the light fedora tries to get past the police guard. He cracks wise and shows the guard a press badge, but is turned away as the morgue is off limits for the night. The newspaper man, Lee Taylor, played by Lee Tracy, heads down the street to the local cat house where he can use the phone. The cat house has a piano player downstairs and a few girls hanging around. The madam, ironically played by Mae Bush, doesn't want non-clients around. Lee calls the newspaper desk and says an old, murdered scrub woman was brought in under mysterious circumstances. Lee says Police Commissioner Stevens, Robert Warwick, Detective O'Halloran, Willard Robinson, and Dr. Xavier, Lionel Atwill, have just arrived at the morgue. The desk editor doesn't believe Lee until he is told to look out the window and he sees that the moon is full. Lee says it's another moon killer murder. The editor tells him to stick with it. On the way out, Lee smarts off to the piano player and says, Hey, Rachmaninoff, how about the prelude? The piano player switches to a perfect Rachmaninoff prelude in C-sharp minor, Opus 3, number 2. Back at the morgue, Lee runs into cop Mike. Mike doesn't know what's going on at the morgue. Mike gives Lee a cigar, and ever the Joker, Lee shakes the cop's hand while wearing a joy buzzer invented in 1928. And I ordered one out of the back of a comic book one time, and it slips on your hand, and it's a wind-up, and all it does is spin. It doesn't buzz. It's a rip-off. Lee followed another ambulance back to the morgue. The police watch as Dr. X examines the body under a sheet. Dr. X says the body was killed by strangulation, and the killer was extremely powerful. There is a scalpel incision at the base of the brain. Dr. X shocks the police when he tells them that the left deltoid of the body had been eaten away by a human. Dr. X says he has to return to a crucial experiment he is conducting. Police Commissioner Stevens stops Dr. X and says there has been 6 full moon murders in the last 6 months, all by strangulation and all with the use of a medical knife tool. Dr. X explains that the individual that did the killing has a kink in the brain that is triggered by something they smell or see or hear. Then the commissioner drops the bomb that all of the murders have been committed in the vicinity of Dr. X's Academy of Surgical Research. The commissioner insists that the killer is from his school, as it is the only place where this type of knife is used is at the academy. Dr. X begs to be allowed to examine his staff so the press will not destroy the academy's reputation. The police agree to keep the story from the press for a short time. When Dr. X and the police leave, a body rises from one of the gurneys. It is Lee, who has been hiding and listening to the conversation. Lee does a little slapstick as he leaves the morgue. At the Academy of Surgical Research, Dr. X is searching for a file at the top of a giant ladder. His daughter Joanne Xavier, Fay Wray, comes into the room, and she screams when she sees the unrecognized person high above the floor. Joanne opens the window to let the moonlight fill the room. She worries that her father is working too hard. He closes the window and complains about the bright moonlight. Dr. X explains to the police that all the students are away from school on a break. They then hear a noise, and Dr. X says it's Dr. Wells, Preston Foster, working on an experiment. Dr. X says Dr. Wells is an expert on cannibalism and has written a book about it and studied it in Africa. The police are very excited to hear this news. The 3 men go into Dr. Wells' lab, and he is very friendly. Dr. Wells has been using electrolysis to keep a heart in a jar alive. The commissioner notes that Dr. Wells' boots are muddy and drying on the radiator. Dr. Wells said he had been out at the waterfront, but then he removes his prosthetic right hand. The police are convinced he is not the man. They next go to see Dr. Haynes, John Ray, no relation. Dr. X tells that Dr. Haynes and 2 other scientists were shipwrecked and left adrift. When they were rescued, one of the men was missing. There was the implication that Dr. Haynes and the other scientists ate the 3rd. Dr. Haynes is also friendly to the group. When he is first shown, he is backlit with green light, His hair and beard gives the illusion of him being the devil. The police find that Dr. Haynes was looking at girly magazines instead of working. He asks Dr. X to get the police out of his lab. They next visit Rowett, Arthur Edmund Crewe, who it turns out was the other scientist that survived the shipwreck. Dr. Rowett has a dark monocle on one eye. His face is also disfigured, as the killer was described. Dr. Rowett studies the moon's rays to determine if they have harmful effects on humans. He also mentions lifting water like an old scrub woman. This catches the commissioner's attention. Dr. Duke, Harry Beresford, rolls into the laboratory in his wheelchair. He's pretty grumpy. The commissioner decides to let Dr. X have a go at finding out if one of his staff is the killer. They settle on 48 hours to test the suspect. Lee appears outside of the second-story window. An outside shot reveals that he is standing on the fire escape. Joanne comes outside and forces Lee down by pulling a gun on him. Lee shows his press badge and makes her think he is a police officer. The police are shown out by the mysterious butler, Otto, George Rosener. Lee is waiting outside the house when a hideous monster comes out of the front door. Lee lights the cigar that Mike the cop gave him. The killer is almost on Lee when the cigarette pops as a trick load was previously inserted. The killer flees at the sound. Lee's story comes out in the morning newspaper with the headline, "Scrub Woman is Moon Killer's latest victim." The editor wants Lee to stay on the story. Lee goes to Dr. X's home. The door is answered by the cleaning woman, Mamie, Lila Bennett. Lee uses flattery and misdirection to gain access to the home. Lee goes into the study and steals a picture of Joanne. He is caught by Joanne as he is stealing a picture of Dr. X. She calls him out about stealing the picture. Lee fesses up that he is a reporter. Joanne is mad about Lee writing the story. She doesn't tell him that Dr. X is going to another location to conduct his examination of the suspect. When Lee goes outside, Mamie dumps a bucket of wash water on him. A train takes the group to Blackstone Shoals, Long Island. They are staying in an old mansion on the edge of a cliff. It looks like the house from Dark Shadows 1966 to 71. Dr. X explains that the surgical knife indicates one of them is possibly the killer. Lee arrives at the mansion via a horse-drawn carriage. Lee climbs a drain pipe and watches the doctors from the balcony. Dr. X proposes that he give a psychological exam. He recommends suicide if anyone is found guilty. Lee climbs back to the ground and accidentally finds a way into the mansion. Lee spills some salt and throws a pinch over his left shoulder. He then spits in his hat. Lee sees a skeleton coming out of the room, but it's simply Otto moving some of the doctor's equipment. Joanne sends the very nervous Mamie off to bed. Lee makes his way to the basement lab. Otto brings Mamie down to the lab and scares her as he does. Lee hides in a room full of skeletons. Otto tells Mamie that she will have to wear the clothes that the murdered scrub woman wore when she was murdered. Dr. X tells her that she has to wear the clothes and act out the part while the experiment is taking place. Otto is playing the part of the killer. The doctors all arrive at the lab. There is equipment that will monitor their responses during the experiment. Dr. Wells hooks the other doctors up to the machines. The full moon shines through the window, but Dr. Duke insists that the shades be closed. Dr. X says Dr. Wells will run the equipment because he only has one hand. In the skeleton room, someone looks at Lee through a hole and then fills the room with smoke. Lee begins to pass out. Dr. X explains what's happening as they turn on the Frankenstein laboratory equipment. He believes the killer was driven to cannibalism and cannot always suppress his desire. All the doctors watch the tube. If their tube fluid goes to the top, they are the killer. Dr. X shows images of people that have been killed. Otto and Mamie come out and begin to reenact the latest murder. A hand is shown flipping the switch and the lights go out. Dr. X sees one tube filled to the top and announces that the killer is Dr. Rowett. The lights come on and Dr. Rowett is dead on the floor. Like the other victims, he has been stabbed in the base of the brain. Dr. Duke has risen from his wheelchair and is walking. Dr. X calls for Dr. Wells just as the missing doctor crashes through the doors of the equipment room. Dr. Wells says he was hit from behind when the lights went out. Joanne is shocked, having seen the body of Dr. Rowett. The group finds Lee passed out in the skeleton room. Lee confesses who he is and why he was hiding in the room. Joanne convinces Lee not to follow his story by agreeing to have breakfast with him. Dr. X orders Otto to watch Lee and make sure he doesn't leave or make a phone call. Otto arrives and takes Lee to his room. Around midnight, Joanne has a worrying dream about her father. Someone is walking in the hall, but she can't see who it is. She finds her father leaning over the dead body. As they begin to leave, Dr. Haynes comes to look at the body as well. Joanne is sent to her room. Otto watches from the shadows. The two doctors confirm that part of the body has been eaten away since it was left alone. In the morning, Joanne and Lee go to the beach, where they flirt a little bit. Joanne sees that someone is watching them from the cliffs. Joanne implies that the way her father was leaning over the body, he may have been eating it. It is Dr. Haynes that is watching from above. Mamie is sick from the previous night's adventure. She is treated by Joanne and Dr. Wells. They all agree that Mamie will not do the experiment. Lee is missing. Lee searches the dark mansion, but his flashlight fails. The hand of the killer reaches from a doorway towards Lee. The killer is scared away at the last minute. Lee enters the killer's door and falls down a chute into another room. Mamie reads the tea leaves in her cup and sees a skull and crossbones. She fills the teacup with dry gin. The commissioner shortens the deadline to midnight. He orders an officer to be at the mansion at midnight. It is 11 p.m. when Dr. X and Wells have the experiment set up. Joanne will be in the role of the victim. Dr. Duke, Dr. Haynes, and Dr. X are attached to the machine and are handcuffed to the chairs. Dr. Wells is the only one from the academy that is loose. Otto prepares Joanne for her role. She is only worried about her father. Otto tells her to keep her eyes closed and to relax. Dr. Wells goes to the control room. Otto is sent to lock all the doors so no one can get in, even Wells. In the control room, Wells stares at the full moon and begins growling like a wild animal. He removes his prosthetic hand. Wells opens a secret door, replaces his hand with a monster hand, and he says synthetic flesh. He turns on an electrical machine and places the hand in the stream until it becomes animated, kind of like the House of Pain in Island of Lost Souls. Dr. Wells covers his face with liquid synthetic flesh until he is transformed into the killing monster that has been shown before. After the synthetic flesh is fully animated, he leaves the room through the chute Lee fell through earlier. Otto is dressed to act out the murder when Dr. Wells, the killer, attacks him from behind. The three doctors are handcuffed in front of the reenactment. Dr. Rowitz, having replaced Otto, approaches Joanne on the stage. She sees his hideous face and cries out. They struggle but cannot get loose. Dr. Wells reveals that he is the killer. Then he becomes a Bond villain and explains how he went to Africa to get flesh samples for his experiments in creating flesh. Lee busts onto the stage and attacks Dr. Wells. Joanne is passed out. Finally, she wakes and sets the three doctors free. Lee is losing the fight bad. Lee throws an oil lamp at Dr. Wells, covering him in flames. Lee linebackers the killer, sending the flaming body over the cliff. They all run in and check on Lee. Lee calls in his story to the newspaper. He is frightened when Joanne pops out of a doorway. They decide they will be married. Lee tells that he used the joy buzzer on the killer. They have a kiss in the dark, and he buzzes her with his gag device. Conclusion. Today's film was an early Technicolor release. However, a black and white version was also shot. The color camera took primary position, and the black and white camera was off to the side, filming at another angle. The color version was sent to major markets, and the black and white copies were sent to smaller markets. The black and white version became the most commonly played version. This gave most people the impression that this film was only in black and white. Warner Brothers did not have a color copy of this film, which was assumed to be lost. Following his death, a color copy was found in the personal collection of Jack L. Warner. The color version was restored in 1978. They call the killer in this film the Moon Killer. The Moon Killer was modeled after Albert Fish. The latter was known as the Moon Maniac for his cannibalistic murder spree that lasted from 1924 to 32. The killer was still on the loose when this film began production. This will tie in with the next film review, The Return of Dr. X, 1939, starring Humphrey Bogart. World famous short summary: beware the light of the full moon. This show is completely free and independent, brought to you without external ads. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe and leave a review where you get your podcast. It really helps the show get found. References and citations are listed for each show on the site at classicmovierev.com. Beware the Moors.